Hey everyone! Welcome back to my new series titled Breaking Down the Soundtrack, a series where I take an in-depth look into the soundtrack of your favorite game, analyze the music, and ask the important questions. This series is aimed to help you understand why soundtracks sound the way they do and some core aspects to them. This series is also a light understanding of how music for game soundtracks works, so if you ever want to start writing, this may help you. In today's episode, we will be taking into the skies for the soundtrack that I was asked to break down titled Ace Combat 7. Now, no more fooling around. Let's take off into the episode. Before we analyze the soundtrack, we need some background information on the game itself. Ace Combat 7 is the 7th entry to the Ace Combat series. Published by Bandai Namco on January 18, 2019, Ace Combat 7 is an arcade-style combat flight action game with both a single-player and a multiplayer mode, much like its predecessor. You as the player play as an Osean fighter pilot in a story game where most of the story is told through cutscenes. Ace Combat as a series revolves around you being in control of a military fighter jet. Controls are about what you'd expect from an arcade flight simulator style of game. But now that we know what the game is about, let's dive into the soundtrack. The Ace Combat 7 soundtrack has gotten quite a bit of fame. Written by Japanese composer Keiki Kobayashi, the soundtrack combines orchestral scoring with the syncopated beats of electronic synth-style music. Overall, the game is a pretty solidified genre of heavy percussion and drastic build-ups. But in the middle of these intense tracks, there are also soft ambient filler tracks. Let's listen to a few of these tracks in the two categories. Overall, there seem to be some pretty common similarities. Some, such as the orchestral scoring mixed with light electronic music, runs throughout the entire soundtrack. A prominent feature in the heavy percussion tracks is their build-up and complex beats. It was actually kind of hard to find tracks that seemed to fit into the filler categories, but on the other hand, there was no short supply of heavy percussion tracks. This shows how in a soundtrack with 63 songs, there seems to be a really dominant genre. And while it's fine to keep things uniform, diversity in a soundtrack can also lead to a very colorful and vibrant soundtrack. With some knowledge about the soundtrack, let's break down one song that could represent it as a whole. The track I chose is titled Daredevil. Written in the key of B flat, it has a lot of characteristics to it that can define the soundtrack as a whole. Let's start by talking about the overall structure. Daredevil starts out with a pretty fast and simple melody, then goes into its first build-up. The track has what sounds to be 3 distinct build-ups, each of which climbs up the scale with its more complex instrumentation parts. Now let's switch over to the instrumentation side of the track, and discuss what sounds are being heard as well as how they are being used. The piece starts off with a syncopated synth playing a fast, complex melody, and brass horns that play the bass lines. After a few measures, the synth is replaced with violins and other stringed instruments, and here's where the build-up starts. Adding more volume to the horns and building up on the few established sounds are what makes the first build-up. After the first build-up, things die back down, but somehow maintain their intense feeling. Maybe it's with the heavy percussion and the horns that come in after the first build-up. These seem to be used to emphasize certain beats after the initial crescendo. The second build-up follows in similar pattern to the first build-up, the only difference being it takes longer to build up and slower to die back down. On that final build-up, every sound previously established gets brought back, with each part being built upon itself, creating this mass orchestration that finishes the majority of the piece in a very dramatic way. Looking at the song as a whole, it has a very strong sense of depth and feel to it, with its crescendos and decrescendos. Now is the part of the video where we start asking the questions. As always, the first and major question being, does it help the game and make it better? Technically, it can go either way, but for now, let me explain why the soundtrack fits. For a game like Ace Combat 7, you're constantly in motion and can't slow down or stop in moments of pure stress and combat. The soundtrack really captures that in songs with its heavy percussion and constant build-ups. The reason why I'm saying the soundtrack doesn't completely fit is simply just because the synth orchestral genre. It's an arcade flight style type of game. It'd make more sense for a soundtrack to be something with like a militaristic snare drum type beat, driving the whole soundtrack. But I think Kobayashi did a fantastic job regardless, creating a great arrangement of tracks to fit all different aspects of the game. The next question is, does it sound like anything we've heard before? Other than the soundtrack of its predecessors, Ace Combat 7 has a very unique soundtrack, combining orchestral scoring with electronic synth sounds and syncopated beats. Just as a final thought, this is one of the most interesting scripts I've made. This was a game recommended for me to do, and I took it up. I personally never played the Ace Combat series, or even heard about it until it was brought up. But that's the beauty of the series. Listening to more and more soundtracks and learning about new games is incredibly interesting and fascinating to me. And I hope that the series will continue to shed some light on smaller games. And that just about wraps up this episode of Breaking Down the Soundtrack. This episode was made live on Twitch, so go follow me there if you want to watch me write the script, break down the music for the series, record the audio, and edit the video. Also, do comment down below what soundtrack you want me to analyze for future videos. Finally, subscribe and hit that bell to make sure you know when I upload and don't miss the next episode. Anything else important will be linked down below. That's all for today. I'm Time Traveler, signing off. Bye bye!